Okay, so we're looking at two different texts today, quite different, and I want to look at them in terms of, and they're so rich. Genesis 1 to 3 is among the most rich texts. In fact, it is the richest text I can even imagine. And I think I've already gone after the documentary hypothesis sufficiently, although I could amplify that and do that at great length, of the historical critical method, which seems to me, even if you ascribe various texts behind it that result in this text, it still leaves us with the challenge or the awareness that this text holds together in a remarkable way. So even if we posit there's an editor who brought all these texts together, we find that there's such a coherence and richness to the text that even trying to find the text behind the text wouldn't be very helpful, because the coherence is in the text. But this is one of the matters of coherence, is the account in Genesis 1. And I got this from, once again, I didn't bring the text with me, that book, The Beginning of Wisdom, but he has plucked it from Leo Strauss on the interpretation of Genesis. Leo Strauss is a political philosopher, a Jewish political philosopher, Aristotelian, actually, in his approach to the discipline. And he notes this about the account of the creatures in Genesis. But I'm going to talk about two very different texts. So Genesis 1 to 3, and 1 is different than 2 and is different than 3, in terms of their literary merits and approach. And I'm going to then look at the story of Joseph. And what unites these stories is that they are really telling us an encounter of dialogue and relationship, and the importance of that, which I talked about in the very first lecture. I think it was the first one, or the second one, when I talked about the word devar, and how God is a word and an event, or the word word entails an event. And we have that here in this account as well. And the infinite problem in this text as well is that when God is said to speak, we still have the problem of who's the author of this account. It's told from the third person narrative perspective, right? So it doesn't, we're told and God speaks, but it's not God telling us that. It's a third person. Who is this third person narrator? You can say it's the Pentateuch, it's the books of Moses. Well, is the narrator Moses? It's not clear in the text exactly. It's sort of coming from nowhere, in the same way that in like we saw last time in Genesis 12, when God speaks to Abraham, or Abram as it is at that point, we're told then the Lord spoke to Abram. Third person narrator, presumably omniscient and trustworthy. But who that narrator is, how he knows this, what Abraham heard, all these things are mysteries, and mysteries that we can't really solve. It's just simply we take the text as it's presented to us, and we're required to do so. But what's interesting here is that this is a really familiar text, the Genesis 1 text, but it doesn't only, it's not just a time sequence that we're given. That's the thing I want to emphasize about the literary features of the text. And this little diagram, I think, makes that clear. It's not just a sequential narrative in terms of time. It seems to have a particular order. In the Middle Ages, Christian scholars debated whether it was an instantaneous six-day creation or whether it took time. It was a gradual thing. And Augustine had the same concerns. What exactly do we mean by the 6 days? Are they to be taken literally, as we would now say, 24-hour chronological, or is it to be taken as a metaphor for some space of time? And part of the problem is the sequencing of what happens within that. And I have long held that this is a question that really can't be answered in many ways. it has to be taken as days because we don't know what a day is other than a literal day. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Even if you say it's a metaphor, the literal grounds the metaphorical. It doesn't make any sense other than to think of it as a day. Even if it means something more than that, it can't be less than that. I've always thought that. And the literary features of it don't take that away. To say that it's a literary reading doesn't deny a historical event, because literature doesn't negate history. In fact, narrative is a historical genre. And this is clearly narrative. But everything in that depends on the nature and meaning of time, which is a big philosophical issue that is actually not even tackled substantially until Augustine comes along in his little biography, Confessions, autobiography. He talks about what time is, which is it is a significant philosophical issue. But the sense of temporality that's connected to the motions of the sun is brought into the question by the simple fact that we have day and night on day one before the sun's appeared, which people never cease to point out. And then there are all sorts of gymnastic ways that interpreters try to suggest, oh, it's not a literal text then because the sun appears after day and night have already happened. And therefore we can ignore the days sequence, and so we can, and that opens the way for, among other things, Darwinistic accounts of evolution, which I think the text actually categorically rules out in the way it describes the life that is created. So there is an element of doubt, but it doesn't allow for a gradual evolution of things. That's not possible from the account as it's told. But there is the problem of the sun appearing after day and night. So how does that problem get solved? There's also the problem of the fact that there's the light in the absence of the sun, and there's no light giving heavenly bodies at the outset, right? So how do we make sense of these? I think it is that the text is not trying to present a scientific treatise in terms of I called it earlier a reporter reporting on events as he saw them happen. That's not the perspective that is being taken here. The perspective is that rather that there's a sense in which we are trying to question sight and depend on what we hear. So what is said, and what is said is what is written, and you need to be attentive to that. And this emphasis on hearing as the primary means of understanding and reading and learning and furthermore living is central to the whole biblical text. The priority of hearing over seeing. And the reason that's important is because in Babylon, for instance, where Abraham just came from, and in most advanced cultures, but it would be the case here in North America as well, they were sky worshippers. They worshiped the heavens. They worship and hard for us to imagine if you grow up in Toronto, because you can barely see the sky. There's light pollution, right? But if you've grown up somewhere where you're away from the city, at night the skies are awesome, and they fill you with wonder and awe. And the Babylonians were sky worshippers. They worshipped the heavens. So where Abraham came from was such a place where the heavens were worshipped and the heavenly bodies and so forth. They left that place. And as I said last time when we looked at Abraham somewhat out of chronological order, I did so for the purpose of making it clear how different God's path of bringing himself a people was. It came by the call of Abraham. He was spoken to. Similarly, we're going to find with Adam and Eve that they're spoken to. So God speaks, we're told in the text, and things happen, and furthermore, Adam and Eve are personally addressed. So speaking is how the events happen, and the words tell us what has happened, but we, to some degree, need to pay very careful attention to the actual details of the text on this. So just as a hypothetical then, what if we're not supposed to rationalize all these incongruities away? The fact that the sun appears after the light and so forth. And this is the suggestion, it seems quite brilliant to me. What if they were intentionally arranged incongruously? Because believe it or not, ancient peoples realized that you had to have a sun in order to have light, and yet light appears before the sun. Guess what? They knew that. They didn't need the scientific method to figure that one out. They really did not. So it was intentionally arranged incongruously, as it is. Like this is really not a great modern discovery that we don't have light without the sun. But it's there in the text first. So how come? What if they're intentionally arranged? Because I think they are. And they're out of an expected order. What if the text is trying to do something different? It's trying to teach us. And it's trying to correct a natural tendency that people would make with assumptions that it can be observed naturalistically in accordance with both the documentary hypothesis of biblical scholarship or even scientific awareness. Like what we see will then explain what comes. So it's entirely rational, but the order's out of order here. So what if it is that we are going to be, God is trying to school us from the idea that we are to base our understanding on what we see rather than what we hear. And I think that is the case, right from the outset. The reason it's incongruous is because it defies our sight, but it doesn't defy our reason. It just needs to be an auditory rather than a visual understanding. Remember, Jesus is the Word of God. He's not the picture of God or the PowerPoint presentation of God. He's the Word of God. He speaks. So that the sun gains for it. So the basis for this, when we note that the sun is the common feature of all the irregularities, so there's light without the sun, there are days or time without the sun, the earth and vegetation appear without the sun, but we observe that all of these things require the sun in order to exist. You can't have vegetation without light. The vegetation dies, and yet they appear before the sun. So the sun is the crux there in that sense. But Genesis is trying to disabuse its readers of the assumption that the gods are in the heavens and they're cosmic beings that can be seen, like the heavenly bodies, which are awesome. But it's not those things. And remember, sky worship is common. It's not universal, by the way. The Canaanites are earth worshippers. They're very confused. Right? They're involved in all manner of sexual immorality because they worship the earth and what comes out of it. Whereas the Babylonians worship what comes out of the sky and so forth. And the Egyptians, on the other hand, they're a very advanced society. They worship technology and science. Think of the pyramids and the discovery of so many things that actually arise out of Egypt, which is being presented as a foil to God's plan. So that you've got the Canaanites who are just corrupt, Baal worship and Moloch worship and so forth. This is just disgraceful, disgusting. But then you have the land of the Babylonians, which Abraham is called out of, and then he goes to the land of the Egyptians, which is presented as a real power in the world, but it's a power akin to the power of Babel, the power of mankind, and the Pharaoh, or the pinnacle of the earthly order, using technology as a way of climbing up to God, the heavens again. So the Genesis, as it is recounted, diminishes the importance of the primary way in which we understand to be through sight. It asserts quite to the contrary that it is through seeing, or hearing, rather. An emphasis which is repeated in the New Testament, the importance of preaching. And it's also the importance of God having revealed himself in words. We have the Bible. which we may be able to read the words, but actually when we read them, we hear the words. And even if we don't speak them, we hear them in our heads. And so there's the primacy of the heard over the seen. And I think that that's there. And there's a demotion of the status of the Son then. So what is going on here? It's almost like a work of apologetics. He's addressing the presuppositions of the way the world works, which is the way that the gods will be something that we can see and we can operate in accordance with that, whereas this God is not seen. He can't be seen. In fact, the essence of idolatry is to worship something created, something that is seen, or something that is part of the created order, the heavens, whereas this God is not something that can be seen. Furthermore, he's a person who speaks. The divine person, which we'll come to when we talk about the account of creation of Adam and Eve. But this is a terrific shift when you think about this. So it's not primarily a historical or temporal story. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. At least not in its sequencing. The sequencing is disrupted in order to say something about the primacy of hearing over seeing in understanding God. So you got to listen to God, and therefore you must revere his word, and you must follow his commandments, and you must obey. We just saw that in the story of Abraham. And isn't that interesting? Like, it just shifts everything. So the problem with the text, oh, what a stupid text. The Son appears after all these things that require the Son. Yeah, no kidding. Well done, Sherlock. Didn't notice that one myself. But then we would notice that there are two parallel accounts going on, by the way, here. So on day by day. So there's first the light, and then there's the creation of heaven, and then there's the creation of earth. Let there be light, and there was light. Let there be the heaven, which separates the space between the waters below and the waters above. And then we get the account of the earth, the dry land, and including the plants. And then we get the creation of the lights, the heavenly lights, the sun being one of them. Then we get the fish and the fowl, and then finally we get the land animals. Now, day 1 corresponds to day 4, 2 to 5, and 3 to 6. Now, note when this is said, and this is going to shock you a bit, I think, God calls it good, right? There's a refrain of good. God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning. The first day calls that good. He will also call the creation of the earth, the lights. So day 3, 4, 5 will also be given the good. What is not called good? God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters, and that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, or heavens, because it's plural in Hebrew. And there was evening, and there was morning the second day. What do you notice that's different about the text? He doesn't call the heavens good. Note. You assume that he does, because it's heavens, where God is. Who else is in heaven? Satan. So a moral ambiguity there. Isn't that interesting? Come to day 3, exact same thing. God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Again, okay, another good. I'll skip over, and rather than take the whole class and read it all, he says the same thing about the 4th day and the 5th day. But then when he comes to the 6th day, God said, verse 24, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, now that's good still, the animals are good, but what he has not said is what comes here. Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And then God blessed them, said, be fruitful and multiply, etc. And then at the end of that, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. But that's a comment on the everything. It's not a comment on mankind. He's not called mankind good. So the heavens are ambiguous. Mankind, I'm not saying mankind isn't good. I'm saying there's an ambiguity there. He hasn't said that man is good. He's in his image. There's a capacity there, in other words, for goodness. But it's not asserted that he's a complete thing, in the same way that the heavens are not asserted to be good, because there's a capacity there for change. Whereas all the fixed things that were created are called good, and that includes the animals. But not mankind is not called good. The good applies to the animals, but not mankind. Which doesn't mean that he's not good, but he's just, there's a moral neutrality. He has the capacity to be good, in fact, and I think that is what is the right reading there. So once again, there's a parallelism. Days 1 brings light. Day 4, the heavenly lights. Day 2 brings the heavens, separating the waters from above from the waters below. Day 5, the living creatures that fill that. Day 3 is the earth of the dry land and the dry plant, or the plants that come forth on the land. And then day 6, the land animals and man. Correspondence there. Right? The second 3 days bring creatures that all have locomotion. They're all able to move. The heavenly bodies are capable of motion. Right? So this is how it starts to parse itself out and down there. They either lack place or they have a place. If they lack place, it's light. That's the first thing that's created. It lacks place. If it has place, what have I done there? I didn't fill out my chart entirely. Oh no, there's nothing there. It is correct. Or it has a place, and everything that falls under that has a place. If they lack a definite place, then they need to be filled yet. That's the heaven, the sea, and the earth. But if they have a definite place, then they get filled in with a region. If they have everything here, they lack it, then it gets filled all the way down to the point where we finally have something that has a place, has a definite place, has local motion, has life, is terrestrial, and is in God's image, and there's only one thing that has that. All the other things, it's either this or that. Now, this is a process of differentiation. And in that, there's a categorical distinction. It gets more and more specific. More and more specific till we finally get to man, and remember that God, it says that God has no image. We can't see him. Man bears God's image. Okay, but we can see him because he's Adam, he's from the earth. But what is it about him that bears God's image? It's not that. It's not that. I found this very interesting. So the main principles at work in creation are, first, there's place, there's separation, there's motion, and there's life, but particularly separation and motion. So places are the regions that we need in order for different kinds of being to flourish. Locomotion is an advanced form of separation. You can move there yourself. You can separate on your own. You have the will to do it, the ability to do it, like animals do. But then there's the differentiation of life. The sun, the moon, the stars, they all move, but they don't have any life. What's being asserted here? By the way, when it says that there's no life in it, it's saying that the heavens are not divine. It's a direct and flat contradiction of the thesis that the heavens contain gods. There's only one God, the God that creates all of these things, and he has life and they don't. So then they can't be heavenly, they can't be divine. It's a direct rebuke to polytheism or pantheism or Gaia worship, which is a remarkably stupid viewpoint, and growing in popularity as people grow in their ignorance in our day. Remarkably stupid. It's the Canaanite, and along with Gaia worship comes, of course, the Canaanite sexual proclivities and actions. Baal and Moloch and so forth. But it's none of these things. So it's an implicit rebuke to the idea that there's any God beside these, because none of them have life. So separation and differentiation is taken. Creation is the bringing of order out of chaos through these acts of separation and distinction. So God is marked by his word, but also his ordering. Order. Hence, worship services to this day are the Apostle Paul insists that they be orderly, that there be a liturgy, that it follow a certain pattern. Obviously, also be centered around the Word, because it's God that we're worshiping. It's not some other thing. We can't see this God, but we can hear him. When we put things that we can see in the place of things that are heard, we have to start asking questions about what we're doing. We can't avoid seeing things unless we're blind. But we ought not to represent God in ways that are going to misrepresent him, because he can't actually be seen, but he can be heard. Yes?
Sir?
You're going to get me in trouble by asking me a hard question that I'll end up... Okay.
No, my mind's pretty boggled. I couldn't ask a difficult question right now.
Okay.
This is amazing. This is just amazing. This is so scholarly and so well thought through. And my question is this. In all the time that you spent, you were overseas, you were here.
This had nothing... Yeah, this is all recent,
though. Churches that you've attended, have you ever heard any pastor expound on creation like you are doing now?
Not quite, no. Not quite.
I haven't either, and I'm wondering why. This is incredible.
Well, I
have to rethink it all through now.
So I've seen it. So the literary approach is helpful, first of all. I really do think so, because as soon as you admit that it's a literary document, and admit also that that doesn't mean that it can't be true, because as soon as you admit literary, some people say, oh, well, then you mean it's a metaphor, and when you say it's a metaphor, it's not really making truth claims. So you have to deal with that. You have to say, I believe it's a literary document. I also think it's saying something true. And it's not a scientific hypothesis, but what is it then? It's the postulate of wisdom. That's what it is. It's the postulate of wisdom. Remember, the Psalms are wisdom literature. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of the Lord. Who's the Lord? He's the guy that speaks. The guy. It's the God who speaks. And so it's not operating on what we see, but what we hear. And there's an element of, we have to accept that, and there's a wisdom, and there's a path to be walked along that, and it's a path that others have trod, and they've been observed in Scripture. The reason for it, I don't know what the reason for it is. It's partly the historical criticism, which has denatured the way the text has been seen. It's partly a concern probably amongst evangelicals about not wanting to suggest it as literary features, because then they give way to the idea that it's not making truth statements. We got to defend the literal sixth day as in a scientific account, as it were. The pietism is good. I don't think it is really sustained by the text.
I'm glad you're here, Dr. Madsen.
Thank you.
I'm 59 years old and the light's starting to go on, but better that than never.
Yeah, sure. It's really, it's transformational in the way you see the text.
Yeah, it sure is.
Because it has to be. But I think that's why, because you're either going to get those that dispute that it really is saying anything. The historical critical method more or less does that here. It's just, who knows? The pious will say it's a literal statement, and I don't think that's helpful either on its own. That doesn't really bear scrutiny. But if you can see it as a literary text, which is every word of it is important, every single word. But how is it to be read? Then that's the question. Then that leads you down the path where you can look at it this way. Yes?
So, like you were saying with day 2 with the heavens, that it wasn't called good at all.
The heavens were not, well, it's just, yeah, I'm just noting.
Because
I'm speculating at that point. I'm just
possibly.
noting that it's not called good. And you would think, well, how come the heavens aren't good? Isn't heaven where God is?
But at the end of day 6, he says, like, and everything that he had made was
Right.
very good. So is there then between day 2 and day 6 the time of the fall, or where?
No, I'm not suggesting anything like that. So you're thinking chronologically there. I don't see it that way. I see it more as it's suggesting that there's a ambiguity in the areas of the heavens and in relation to mankind. Everything else is said to be good, and everything as a whole is said to be very good. It holds together very good. Well, what sort of statement is that? Is it a moral statement? When you say good, it could be, and we often take it to be a moral statement. God is moral. Actually, the fact that he uses the word good suggests a moral nature. I've always said that. I think that's correct. But you can take good in the sense that it's been well done and properly done and so forth, but the moral goodness of the beings, that's going to remain to be seen, because remember, mankind is given freedom to choose. That's going to be the basis of the whole Genesis account. They're going to be given the choice to disobey. There's that tree, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may eat of all these trees, but not that one. So there's freedom there. And with freedom, there's a moral ambiguity. You can't call them good if before they've actually made their choices. They have the capacity for goodness. There's no doubt about it, because they're made in God's image. But even with respect to the heavens, there's a moral ambiguity there, because it's not called good. So are there beings in heaven that are capable of falling away? And I think, yes, so that opens up the text there by other information that we find out later. Because if it was all called good, then how does it not become good? Well, there was an ambiguity there, which is the function of the freedom. Milton talks about this in Paradise Lost. Sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such created he all, the heavenly beings and the earthly, that bear his image. And then he goes on at great length about why that is. Because in order to love, they're created by love, for love. They have to have the capacity to love God for his own purpose. Just because he commanded them and because he loved them, they're going to love him back. How would you know this other than the fact they can choose not to love him? So there's an extended explanation there by God, rather defensive at that. But still, that's just the Genesis 1 text. But I think once you see that, it becomes quite fascinating. So differentiation, and by the way, the differentiations are all good. So if you try to mix things that are differentiated, this is not only not good, this is wicked. One of the other differentiations, by the way, when it comes to being made in God's image, verse 27, God created man in his own image, man in the sense of anthropos here, humanity, generic term. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. There's another differentiation within mankind. And the two together are differentiated, but the two will come together, and there's a unity in their differentiation there. So let me just talk very briefly about mankind before I get off topic on this. I want you to note another thing about the text. God speaks all over the place. God says, and let us, and then he says it, and then it happens. But he never addresses anything personally. He doesn't speak to the earth. He doesn't speak to the water. He doesn't speak to the sky. He doesn't speak to the planets. Why? Well, because they don't have life, for one thing. That would be ridiculous, because you'd speak to people, persons, But even having life is not a sufficient grounds for being spoken to. So the birds and the fish and the animals are not spoken to. They're spoken into being. Where they're called good. God clearly loves them. He thinks that they're well done. But he doesn't speak to them. He speaks to mankind, however, and then gives them the commandment. Very interesting. What does that suggest? One is partly it's the imago Dei, that they are like him, capable of language and hearing and understanding. When you speak to somebody, you assume that they have the capacity to respond. You can talk to the wall, but nobody thinks that the wall's going to answer back unless they've got issues. Right? We think that there's a problem there. I mean, I talk to myself, but I don't expect a different person to answer back. I don't expect it. So far it hasn't happened either. With this mumbling, this internal grumbling. But God speaks to them, and he assumes that they're able to respond. Their response able. This is my friend and colleague Victor Shepard's point. Their response able, that means they're responsible. They're able to respond, therefore they're morally accountable to him. He commands them. The imperative further suggests the lordship of the Creator, if it were in any doubt. So they may bear the image of God, but guess what? They're not gods, because he brought them out of the earth furthermore. So they are not gods. So none of the created order is, and neither are they. Which is an assertion directly contradictory to all the religions of the world, at least all the religions that are not theistic. They think that there's gods in us or something like that, or spirituality, contemporary spiritual nonsense. That we're semi-divine. Note that God, the creation of mankind, they're not created out of God. It's not ex deo. They're created ex nihilo, just like everything else. They're created out of nothing or out of the earth. They're formed from the earth. But they bear God's image. What that means, to bear the image of God, is not made clear in this text. But I will note one further thing. It says that they're made in the image of God, but it doesn't say that they are the image of God. Who is the image of God? Jesus. He is the image of God, whereas they're in the image of God. Look for yourself. Colossians 1:15. He is the image of the invisible God. Whereas they're in the image, and they are not yet the image, however, but they could become like him were they to be morally good and obedient. But they are about to prove that they're not. So they're still going to have the image of God, because that cannot be taken from them because they didn't create it. He gave them that image. If they lost the image of God, they wouldn't be human at all. They retain the image of God. And we see that this is the case because in Genesis 9, for instance, to Noah, there's a prohibition against murder. Why? Because man bears the image of God. That's the rationale for it. Precisely, because they bear the image of God, you may not shed man's blood, even though they're terrible. God says that they're terrible, but they still retain the image of God, as bad as they are. So that doesn't go away, but they are not good, despite bearing the image of God, because now they're sinful, as we know. By the way, if they were not bearing the image of God, even as sinners, they could never be redeemed. And if God, by the way, bore sin, he couldn't redeem them, because he would bear the consequences of sin. Right? So he's back to this text. God speaks to Adam, or man rather, in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female. He addresses them. He assumes they're able to respond. He commands them responsibility. And what does he command them to do? He blesses them and says, be fruitful and multiply. And this is just like the other things. Now they're going to fill what he has created. A definite place is now going to be a habitation. It's going to be filled up. Note there's also subduing and filling. So he subdues in the sense that he separates, and then he fills it. mankind has been given this, and now he's going to say, subdue the earth, bring it under your dominion, and fill it with your people, with people that bear your image and my image. I have met Christians, by the way, who don't have children now and think that they're being godly by doing so, which is an extraordinary state of affairs. Violates the very first commandment.
Do you mean that they think they're being godly?
They're getting rid of their their footprints by not producing carbon-producing beings. So they're being pious in some way. What's the assumption behind that? There's all sorts of them. You could talk the whole class about that. Remember, our dominion over the earth is under God's stewardship. We're responsible to him. You can't serve God by being disobedient. You may not have children, but the choice not to have them in order to be God-honoring is not God-honoring, or at least not this God. But we saw it last time that God actually, in order to teach people that their own generative capacities are not their own and that they are divine beings, he strikes the patriarchs' wives with infertility for a season. They're barren, to show them it's all a God-given gift, but you have to use the gift. But all gifts come from God. All good gifts. This is Leo Strauss's commentary. From the principle of separation, light, which allows discernment and distinction, because you can't distinguish things if you can't see them, via something which separates, heaven, to something which is separated, earth and sea, to things which are productive of separated things, trees, for example, then things which can separate themselves from their places, heavenly bodies, then things which can separate themselves here from their courses, brutes, so brutes don't stay in their place, they're not set in the firmament so they go around in their own course, they can go wherever they want, they can wander around. And finally, a being which can separate itself from its way, the right way. Who is this being? Mankind. We are so free that we can separate ourselves even from the path that God set us upon. In other words, there's a capacity for sin. The whole created world is conceived to be characterized by a fundamental dualism, things which are different from each other without having the capacity of local motion, and things which, in addition to being different from each other, do have the capacity of local motion. This means that the very first chapter of Genesis seems to be based on the assumption that the fundamental dualism is that of distinctness, otherness, as Plato would say, and of local motion. The dualism chosen by the Bible, the dualism as distinguished from the dualism of male and female, is not sensual but intellectual, noetic, and this may help us to explain the paradox that plants precede the sun. Well, that's Strauss's commentary. I'm not quite so sure about that. Strauss, by the way, was a homosexual. Just observe. Presuppositions are brought to bearing on the text. So strike the last sentence. I think the differentiation there is quite clear, and it's not only an intellectual differentiation. It is clearly a physical as well as intellectual differentiation. And we will find this because when they go again to the land of Canaan, there is dishonoring of the bodies and so forth. But Romans 1 is a commentary on all this once again. Very interesting. Comments or questions? But I've laid that out, and that figure that I've put on here, I will put on the website. So if you can't see it at the back or whatever, you'll be able to copy it out from there. Okay? This idea that mankind is distinct and separate from the other creatures is under extreme attack in our day. It's called speciesism, if you haven't heard of it. So the Princeton philosopher Peter Singer is now disputing the fact that mankind is a distinct being, and on the basis of that thinks that we ought to be able to commit not only abortion up until birth, but even infanticide, because we kill animals. And he thinks that there's a better reason to do it than to kill animals furthermore. So there's an attack on the distinctiveness of human nature in our day. There's also an attempt to transform human nature, which is called transhumanism, and that happens through the technological route of the Egyptians. All of these are attempts to change something that God has called, that is created in God's image, and to do something with it, to perfect it. It's taking the dominion mandate and it's applying to humanity, as if the mankind itself were a thing to be perfected by means of things that are seen, rather than things that are heard. Because that's what's going on here, right? Transhumanism is the attempt to perfect human nature in accordance with what we can see and what we plan, rather than in accordance with obeying and listening what God says. But the dominion mandate's being worked out in either case, if that makes any sense. Note that when we come to Genesis 3, and I'm going to have to skip over to, I could spend so many classes on this because it's just, they're so rich, that when we come to Genesis, first of all here, let me just conclude with Genesis 2. 2:25, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. That's the conclusion of Genesis 2. The serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desired to make one wise," path of wisdom, sees with her eyes, "she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." Note that the description of the immediate consequence of the fall is that their eyes are opened. Now they look with their eyes, and it's not, they don't listen. She listened to the serpent rather than listening to God. Sight, hearing. And then their eyes are open. What do they see? Well, they see they're naked. Well, they were naked before. What's changed? That they judge by sight. And furthermore, when they judge by sight, they make of themselves gods. And when they do that, they no longer see somebody to love, they see something to possess. Because if they're gods, then everything around them isn't a god. And so when Adam looks on Eve, he says, "I'm a god, she's a thing." So he looks at her as an object. Vice versa. The two are aware that their thoughts are shared by the other person who can speak. So what do? Cover themselves up. Not because they don't want to see the other person, but because they don't want to be seen. So shame results, etc., etc. Again, I've preached on this text. It's a huge text. And when you get into the Hebrew, it becomes even more interesting. But vital text. Note that it happens all through commentary. There's a dialogue that is at the heart of the texts that we've just dealt with, and they imply encounter and relationship. Essential. Genesis 3 is a mini tragedy, by the way. That's how Milton casts it even. When he writes Paradise Lost, he says we must turn these notes to tragic. And Genesis 3 is sort of a mini tragedy. And then they do become as gods. But what sort of gods? Gods in the sense that they have the power to choose, but now they've chosen evil. So they're not going to be, God didn't call them good, and now they become not good. Because he's done what he told them expressly not to do. Note that, as I said, they were never called bad. There was a lack of commentary there. And that's because they had the freedom to become that if they had obeyed. And of course, Jesus would obey. And so Jesus' obedience and the fact that we bear his image, he gives us his image, in fact, when we're born again, we become good in God's sight. He calls us good because we bear Christ's image, the man God. Further comments or questions? Because now I need to move on to Abraham, believe it or not. I'd like to stick on the text, but I want to. Sure.
Are there any video recordings or recordings of you preaching on this subject?
There was, but I think now it's an audio. But I think it exists. But it was once a video, but I think it got shrunk down to an audio. I'll try and put it up. Yeah. But it's just on this Genesis 3:1-7. Yes.
Is this the right place to reference your previous course?
Which course? Lewis Tolkien?
Subcreation and...
Yeah, sure. So you want me to comment how it relates to this?
Actually, I wanted to tell you that I understand now something.
Oh, good.
Because
That wasn't clear in the course.
in Paralandra, it was fascinating to me that the king and the lady in front of the archangels of Mars and Venus told Ransom, this is the beginning, the first day.
Right.
But that was after they had passed the test.
Right. Yeah.
They didn't fall like Adam and
Yeah,
Eve.
again, and so that's a really interesting point because it just raises to mind what day did this happen? The fall, like what we're told about those days, but what day did this take place on? It's not clear at all. It's just not commented on. So there's a creation of them, and now we're just waiting around. I'm not saying it didn't take place in time. It's like it's sort of a lack, waiting around for this encounter to take place. And this is the first day, you pass the test, okay, but now things are going to get better and better. And will be very different from the world, the fallen world, which Mr. Ransom came from. Which nonetheless had the privilege of being the venue in which God himself took on human flesh. And so they are commenting on how much superior our world is precisely because Malaldil himself came down and bled. So when Ransom's heel's bleeding, he said, this is true. And this is the substance wherewith God remade the cosmos. All that stuff. Everything got remade through that. This is extraordinary. The other thing, final comment on the text. There's two other aspects to it. There's a demand for righteousness and there's a demand for holiness. Righteousness with respect to the created order, including other human beings, and holiness with respect to God. These are demands there.
Can you just say that again?
Righteousness is expected of human beings. It's part of the, I think, in the likeness, there's a connotation there. Whereas towards God, we're to be holy, or to be set apart. We're not to be like the things that we see. We're to be like the things that are spoken to and obey. So we're set apart. The word holy means set apart, different, right? You're not like those things that you're a part of, even though you're come out of the earth. You're to be holy. It's the actual root commandment of Scripture, Leviticus 19:2. Be holy even as I, the Lord your God, am holy. What does that mean to do? Follow the holiness code. What does the holiness code command? Differentiation. Don't do this, do that. And absolute categorical distinctions. But above all, to obey. You have to listen. And then in Deuteronomy 6, you go and you teach your children, obeying God's commandments. Bind them on your foreheads, tablets on your hearts, on your wrists, so your deeds, on your passions, on your intellect. It's on the doorposts of your house, so it governs the domestic sphere, and it's on the gates of your city. The whole of civic life should be governed by obedience to God's word. So it's a complete teaching. This is all about education, by the way. Genesis is about the education of humanity after the fall. Here's the guys that didn't listen. Adam and Eve, they didn't listen. Abraham, will you listen? And the answer is yes, he will. We saw that last time. And in the process, he learns that he's not to act like the Babylonians did. And he's to regard his wife as his wife. She's different than the woman that you had a child with, Hagar. That's not your wife. And this is your boy, and this is your son. And your son, you have to act in a certain way. So he learns to be a father, and he learns to be a husband, and these are important to God. And he takes time to teach Abraham that, and we'll find the other patriarchs are similar. They're being taught lessons about what it means to bear the image of God, to be like him. Faithful, set apart, not having sexual relations with other people or things, worshiping him and him alone, not any other created things, etc. Right? Don't bow down to the idols of, or don't reverence the heavens, Abraham, as your ancestors would have done. And don't be like the Egyptians who worship power and technology, which is a pretty potent reminder to us because we worship both of those in our day. Actually, we're sort of Canaanites and Egyptians combination. Not many sky worshippers anymore, but lots of Canaanites in our midst and lots of technology worshippers. So you have to listen with a moral awareness, and then you become who you were meant to be. Anyway, that's taught there, and I just think it's endlessly fascinating. But that's if you hear the sermon, I'm not going all over the place like that. I talked about Genesis 1 and the whole big picture there. But let me go to the story. Another question. Sorry, was there another question I forgot? No? Okay. Then let me come to the story of Joseph, which I think is also fascinating. I love the story of Joseph. I always have. It's built around the motif or the plot line of the suffering servant. First time. We have a hero, and he is a hero. He performs miraculous deeds, but he is a suffering servant, suffering undeserved punishment. And in the process, doing great good for others. Providence, in other words, overarches the whole story. The story of Joseph is not like that of Abraham. It's not like that of Isaac. It's not like that of Jacob. There's a U-shaped movement of the comic plots, so it's got a happy ending. So it's comic, and it's a comedy in the sense that it ends with delight. There's a possibility of tragedy, so it swings down, goes down into the pit, literally, gets brought into where? Egypt, the land of power and technology. Canaan is a land of fertility and plenty. It's a rich land. But he's going to be brought, his family who's wandering there are going to be struck with famine, whereas Egypt is going to be a place of rich blessing. Lots of interesting contrast there. But there's some catastrophic events that happen in Joseph's life, and there's some interesting ones as well, but some of them are catastrophic. But the story is structured around a whole sequence, and I talked about the sequential nature of biblical narrative. This happens and then this happened, and there is I said consequential, not just sequential, consequential. So because of this, the character is now able to move on to that. And providence is demonstrated in the consequential nature of what happens. And note also the choices that the character makes determine a great deal. So he first begins as a family outcast. Well, he first begins as the miraculous dream interpreter and dreamer, for that matter, for which reason his brothers become jealous. But we're probably a little annoyed with Joseph as well. We'd kick him in the shins if he were our brother. put it mildly. I'm not sure we'd throw him down into a pit, but maybe we would. He ends up being brought and sold into slavery. He's schlepped off to Egypt, of all places, which appears prominently here and even more so in Exodus, where we've already heard God speaking to Abraham saying that they will spend 400 years there. So now here's how it's going to happen. Then he becomes the keeper of Potiphar's estate, a dominion, exercises his dominion and God's providence there by being faithful and honest. Then he's also a prisoner. He's an interpreter of dreams, and he ends up being a political administrator of greater power than anyone save Pharaoh himself, and thereby becomes the means of deliverance for his family. So he's the suffering servant, but he's also a deliverer. Of who? A whole nation, as it turns out. But the nation doesn't yet exist. There are 12 brothers. So they're delivered into Egypt, and then they'll have to be delivered out of Egypt. 3 pairs of dreams, by the way. And there's a sort of a structure of 3s here. So there are the dreams of the sheaves and the sun, the moon and the stars in Genesis 37. And then there's the 2 dreams of the prisoners in Genesis 40, if you recall. And then finally the 2 dreams of Pharaoh. 7 fat cows followed by the 7 lean cows and so forth. Genesis 41. So the dreams not only occur in pairs, the dreams that are there earlier or throughout, they also foreshadow the whole symmetry of the story. So it's not just that there are 2 of them. So the second tends to be a confirmation that it's definitely going to happen. But the dreams are a foreshadow of what will take place in the story as well. So they're prophetic. They're not just dreams. And they unify by anticipating the climax. So they give away the plot in that sense. But the plot does not lack for suspense because the plot's been given away. Because again, they're dreams, and we tend to have a little skepticism surrounding dreams, particularly since we have some suspicions about Joseph's character. Like wears his Technicolor dream coat, and he's a little bit of a boaster, and his dreams we're not quite so sure. So he has these dreams at the outset that his father and his brothers will bow down before him, just as the sheaves bow down to him, and so do the sun, the moon, the stars. And yet he's been thrown into prison. So that doesn't seem like that's going to work out very well for him, does it? Not at first. But then he tells the prisoners, predicts their dreams and what they will mean, and he gets it exactly right, and he gets it quite immediately. So then it begs the question, once that's happened, how about those earlier dreams? I'm talking about if you've never read the story and you're reading it for the first time. So he is able to interpret dreams. He does it very well, in fact. Well, how about the ones that have not yet happened? We now think, those could well be somehow going to be fulfilled in the future. And then he comes to Pharaoh once again. He predicts, but at that point, now there's a longer sequence, a longer wait to see whether he's going to be correct. Well, the 7 years of plenty are followed by the 7 years that's 14 years. That's a longer time. But now we know for certain that the 2 dreams that we heard at the outset, the 2 images, the sheaves bowing down to him, and then the sun and the moon, the stars bowing down, we know that those are going to come because the 2 that followed it have been fulfilled. So we're now expecting this to happen. Right? So the background action of the story foresees the conclusion. So it has a unity in the dream sequences. So there's a strong sense of providential destiny in that. And it all transpires through the revelation of what's going to happen through dreams. But again, God's providence is the emphasis. There's an order and a purpose, and at the end of it, Joseph himself is the one who declares the meaning. It's not a dream. You intended that for wrong, but God intended it for good and for the deliverance of you, right? That's his conclusion about looking backwards on all of that stuff. When you threw me into the pit, you didn't intend a good thing, but God did. That's an fascinating comment. He didn't know it at the time, became clearer to him at the end of the story. So providence is something that does tell us about how God is going to guide us in the future, but actually, while you're walking through it, even though you know it's providential, you can't sitting there smiling, saying it's all providential, this is great, I know God intends this to be good. That's not how it appears to you. I don't think Joseph is smiling. Although Paul says to account it pure joy when you're undergoing all kinds of trials. Why? Because this is characteristic of God. It's characteristic. In fact, there's no plan B. That's how he himself operated. God himself suffered many things. At the end of it, he did what God had set him out to do. The same thing is going to happen to you. Account it pure joy. But that's a command, by the way. That doesn't mean your feelings about it get particularly warm and fuzzy. It's more, this is an encouragement. This is not a contradiction of who God is. This is how he works. And this is the first story that really demonstrates that. The foreshadowing that takes place is intensified when the dreams of the prisoners become realities, as I say, because at that point, we think all the dreams could potentially be so. But the one that's giving it at the very first is the last one to be fulfilled, and that's the most important one. Note that they will bow down to him, which is interesting. They're not bowing down to Pharaoh, who's the ruler of Egypt. They're bowing down to Joseph. There's also a sequence of 4 places. The pit into which Joseph's brother throw him is followed by Potiphar's house, where he's in a prison of sorts. I'm not quite sure what it looks like. Prisons don't always have iron bars the way our prisons do, but he's under house arrest at the very least. And then the final aspects of the story take place in the land of Egypt itself, where Israel will end up serving for 400 years, in servitude rather. So it's a funny old thing. So they're delivered from the famine in order to be brought into servitude, which is all part of God's providence. And you think, what a weird sense. Like, this is a God who wants to bless us. Why on earth is he putting his people into servitude then? Well, 1, he's already predicted that's what he's going to do. But 2, because then he's going to deliver. The pattern of, you're going to be brought into prison, you're going to suffer, and I'm going to deliver you, that's again being established, reinforced throughout Scripture. People go astray, God rescues them. They suffer, they genuinely suffer, they cry out to the Lord. But there's a principle of increasing threat throughout the sequence. Because now they're in slavery under bondage of Egypt. So the story ends, this is great. He's saved his whole family. That's the good news. The bad news is that they're in Egypt and they're going to be there in 400 years under harsh, increasingly harsh slavery. So that's how the story of Genesis ends, the story of beginnings. And it will then pick up in Exodus with them in extreme duress. With already, because of what has taken place in the story of Joseph, an expectation that God will work in the midst of the duress. So there's already a hope that's in the reader when you come to Exodus on the basis of what we've just heard in Genesis. Right? So again, the sequential nature of the stories in Scripture as well, and consequential. There are other features of the story, but I think I'm running out of time. Questions on this? Yes, sir.
Back in those days, what would be the average lifespan of a man? The long livers had ceased to be, right?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, 400 years. So if you were in Israel...
Yeah, those are the patriarchs that they're no longer that, by.
So,
How long does Moses live?
120,
120 years.
40, 40, 40.
Sorry? 40,
It says
40, 40.
40.
Yes, yes, you're correct.
I'm just thinking what it would be like to have been an Israelite born in Egypt during that 400-year period of captivity. It wouldn't appear as if there was any hope.
It would probably appear like it did to the Jews between the two testaments, the 400 years there.
Yeah.
Between God's last speaking through the prophet, right, Malachi, and the coming of Christ. Probably like that. Where's God? Has he forgotten us? And so, yeah. But the 40, 40, 40, that's fascinating again. Yeah. All right, let me stop with that.